Hello. A few days ago, I got through listening to this audiobook, George Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London. Now, I know it's like almost 7 hours long, but I'm only going to show 3 minutes of it. And of course, being a men's rights channel, what he's discussing is the relationship of men to women. The protagonist in the story finds himself out of work. And then by this stage, he becomes a tramp. And this is what Orwell has to say about this.
The second great evil of a tramp's life, it seems much smaller at first sight, but it is a good second, is that he is entirely cut off from contact with women. This point needs elaborating. Tramps are cut off from women in the first place because there are very few women at their level of society. One might imagine that among destitute people the sexes would be as equally balanced as elsewhere, but it is not so. In fact, one can almost say that below a certain level, society is entirely male. The following figures, published by the LCC from a night census taken on February the 13th, 1931, will show the relative numbers of destitute men and destitute women. Spending the night in the streets, 60 men, 18 women. In shelters and homes not licensed as common lodging houses, 1,057 men, 137 women. In the crypt of St. Martin's in the Fields Church, 88 men, 12 women. In LCC casual wards and hostels, 674 men, 15 women. It will be seen from these figures that at the charity level, men outnumber women by something like 10 to 1. The cause is presumably that unemployment affects women less than men. Also that any presentable woman can, in the last resort, attach herself to some man. The result for a tramp is that he is condemned to perpetual celibacy. For of course it goes without saying that if a tramp finds no women at his own level, those above, even a very little above, are as far out of his reach as the moon. The reasons are not worth discussing, but there is no doubt that women never, or hardly ever, condescend to men who are much poorer than themselves. A tramp, therefore, is a celibate from the moment when he takes to the road. He is absolutely without hope of getting a wife, a mistress, or any kind of woman except very rarely, when he can raise a few shillings, a prostitute. It is obvious what the results of this must be. Homosexuality, for instance, and occasional rape cases. But deeper than these, there is the degradation worked in a man who knows that he is not even considered fit for marriage. The sexual impulse, not to put it any higher, is a fundamental impulse, and starvation of it can be almost as demoralizing as physical hunger. The evil of poverty is not so much that it makes a man suffer, as that it rots him physically and spiritually, and there can be no doubt that sexual starvation contributes to this rotting process. Cut off from the whole race of women, a tramp feels himself degraded to the rank of a cripple or a lunatic. No humiliation could do more damage to a man's self-respect. The other great evil of a tramp's life.
There you go. He said a world in 3 minutes. First of all, he wrote this in 1933. So it shows that men suffered, from the deselection process. And what's so important about it now, 90 years later, is that, the protagonist was a tramp. He had to be homeless. Now, the average guy is being deselected because what he doesn't know then is that you basically had to be homeless because women wanted to shack up with a guy, so he would do the heavy labor she otherwise wouldn't want to do. And nowadays, women have easy, clean jobs. And so they have thrown away the average guy. They have deselected the average working guy. So that's why you have all these all these employed guys who are single and celibate. The incel, right? So he's also mentioned something that you probably is getting hard to define now is stats showing that that's the case, that homeless men are mainly the homeless population is mainly men. And he has all these stats, right? That back then, even back then, 90 years ago, that he was showing like below a certain level, it's basically a man's life. That the girls rarely reach that low. They have all these safety nets, and he tells you that employment isn't as important to the women, which is true today. That women have the option of shacking up with a man, even though they themselves are unemployed, which is true today. He shows that it is a spiritual as well as a physical effect, detriment, that is, to guys who are shunned. And here's another thing. All these guys who, when you start pointing these out, that say, have you ever talked with women? These guys he's talking about that are deselected, they're surrounded by women. There's 50% of the population is women, but there's now a wall between the average homeless man, or not the average, homeless men, and the average woman on the street. There's a social barrier that they cannot penetrate. So they are enforced celibacy. And what's so important about it today is, again, the average guy who's even working but a low end job is no better than a tramp to the average woman. And something that I didn't play in this audiobook from it, that is, was that the main protagonist, when he was a tramp, ran into a homeless woman. And the character says, this is the first one I've ever met. And the homeless woman wanted nothing to do with the homeless men. She had contempt for them and looked down on them, even though she was one of them. Well, her situation was the same, but she's not one of them. As a woman, she is above them. She sees herself as above them. And so when he says there's very few women on that level, even the ones on their level do not want anything to do with them. So this is 90 years ago, and he's talking about male issues. And George Orwell, his stories, he was very truthful about the opposite, not that the opposite sex, but I'm just saying the dynamics between both sexes. He would probably be considered a misogynist now if some person read his works. But in any event, the real point of all this is to say, since the average guy is getting deselected, he has to find something in his life besides looking for some woman to fill the void, because they refuse. So since they refuse, what are you going to do? So this is what men have to deal with. There's no, quote unquote coming back, because the women in his day were only using men just like they are now. If the man's not supplying the woman with what she wants, and he's not high status enough, she doesn't want anything to do with him. So all you guys who are in that boat, I mean, you've got to get on with your lives. So that's what I have to say about this. Thank God for George Orwell. This is, like I said, written in 1933. So it's 90 years ago. And you see, the only thing that has changed really is that more men are getting deselected. Men who are actually higher up than homeless and tramps are now being deselected. Okay, goodbye, everyone.